I used to think loneliness had a sound, something obvious, something you could hear the moment it entered a room. But that's not how it started for me. It started quietly while everything still looked normal. My name is Maria. I'm 45 now, and if you had seen my life from the outside back then, you probably wouldn't have noticed anything wrong. A family, a home, people moving in and out of rooms, conversations happening, meals being made, everything was there. And still, something wasn't. I don't remember the exact day we arrived in California. People always ask that like it should be a clear memory, but it isn't. What I remember is the light. It was too bright, not warm, not comforting, just overwhelming. Like someone had turned the world up too high and I didn't know how to adjust my eyes. I was young. 6, maybe 7. Old enough to notice things that didn't feel right, but too young to explain them. My mother held my hand tightly at the airport, tighter than usual. I remember trying to pull away at one point, not because I wanted to leave her, but because her grip felt desperate, like she was afraid I might disappear. And maybe she was. Everything around us felt unfamiliar. The language, the faces, even the way people moved. Back home, things had been smaller, slower, predictable. Here, everything felt wide open. Too open, like there was space for anything to happen, including losing yourself. School came quickly after that. I still remember my first day, not the details exactly, but the feeling of it. Sitting at a desk that didn't feel like mine, watching other kids talk and laugh in a language that moved too fast for me to catch. Their words blurred together. I tried to follow. I really did, but it felt like standing on the outside of something invisible, close enough to see it, but not close enough to be part of it. The teacher smiled at me often. She was kind, but even her kindness made me uncomfortable, because it drew attention to me. It reminded everyone and me that I didn't belong there yet. I learned to nod. That became my way of surviving those early months. People would talk and I'd nod, even when I didn't understand. Especially when I didn't understand. It was easier that way. At recess, I stayed near the fence. No one told me to. It just felt safer. There was something about having a boundary behind me that made the rest of the world feel less overwhelming. I would watch the other kids play, study them, the way they ran, the way they laughed, the rules of games I didn't know yet. Sometimes when I got home, I'd try to copy what I saw. Small things, movements, expressions. It felt like practicing a version of life I hadn't fully stepped into. Our house wasn't big, just enough space for what we needed. My parents worked long hours, so most of the time it was quiet. My father didn't speak much when he got home. He carried something with him, not anger, not exactly. Just a kind of heaviness that settled into the room. My mother filled that silence the only way she knew how. Movement. She was always doing something. Cooking. Cleaning. Folding laundry late into the night. The sound of dishes. The rhythm of routine. It wasn't a loud house. We didn't talk about feelings. We didn't talk about loneliness. We just lived around it. I think that's where it really began. Not in a moment. Not in something you could point to, but in the absence of something that should have been there. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned how to blend in. My English improved. I knew when to laugh, when to stay quiet, how to answer questions in class without drawing too much attention. From the outside, I looked like I had adjusted. But inside, I still felt like I was watching everything from a distance. Like there was a thin layer between me and the world that never fully went away. At 17, I got married. When I say it now, it sounds too young. I know that, but back then it didn't feel strange. It felt certain, and certainty was something I had always been searching for. He was older than me, calm, responsible, someone my parents approved of immediately, which mattered more than I realized at the time. There was comfort in that approval. It felt like I was stepping into something stable, something structured, a life that made sense. I didn't question it. I didn't know how to. In the beginning, it wasn't unhappy. That's important to say. We had routines. Simple ones. Dinner at the same time every evening. Weekends spent running errands, visiting family, doing the kinds of things people do when they're building a life together. There was a rhythm to it, and I fit into that rhythm easily. Maybe too easily. I didn't ask myself if I was happy. I just assumed this was what happiness looked like. Something steady, predictable, quiet, but over time things shifted, not all at once. Nothing in my life has ever changed all at once. It was gradual, subtle, the kind of change you don't notice until you're already deep inside it. Conversations became shorter, not colder, just shorter, less curious. Decisions started happening without me, small ones at first. Things that didn't seem worth questioning, and then bigger ones. I didn't protest, I adjusted. That became my pattern. Adjusting, shaping myself around whatever was needed. Without realizing that, little by little, I was disappearing inside that process. It wasn't that he was cruel. If he had been, maybe I would have recognized the problem sooner. Cruelty is easier to name. This was different. Controlled. Quiet. Like the edges of my life were slowly closing in, and I didn't see it happening. By the time I had my first child, something inside me had already started to fade. But I didn't notice, because motherhood came quickly. And with it, a new kind of purpose. Then another child and another, 4 in total, 2 daughters, 2 sons. People would smile when they talked about my life. A full house, a complete family. They would say I was lucky. And I was. In many ways, I really was. My children became everything to me. They gave my days structure. Meaning, direction. Every decision I made revolved around them. And for a long time, that felt enough. My mornings started early. The sound of cereal pouring into bowls. The rush of getting everyone ready for school. Finding shoes that had somehow gone missing overnight. Packing lunches. Braiding hair. It was chaotic, but it was a kind of chaos that made sense. Afternoons were quieter, but not by much. Homework at the kitchen table. Snacks, small arguments. Laughter that filled the house in a way nothing else could. Evenings were dinner. Cleaning, preparing for the next day. And nights were when the silence came back. Laundry folding, dishes, the low hum of the house settling down. I got used to being tired, not just physically. There's a kind of tiredness that lives deeper than that. It settles behind your eyes, in your thoughts, in the spaces where your own voice used to be, and over time, you stop asking yourself certain questions. I stopped asking myself what I wanted, not because I didn't have wants, but because there was no space left to hear them. Years passed like that, quietly, without clear markers. My children grew up faster than I expected. One day they needed help tying their shoes, and then suddenly they were driving, working, living lives that didn't need me in the same way anymore. I told myself that was the goal. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Raise them well enough that they don't need you forever. And I had done that. So why did it feel like something was slipping away? The house started to change, not physically, but in the way it felt. Rooms that were once full of noise became still. Chairs stayed empty longer. The kitchen felt bigger somehow, even though nothing had moved. At first, I told myself it was just an adjustment, a new phase, something I would get used to. But when the last one left, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy, like it had weight, like it was pressing against me in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. And that's when everything else began to unravel, not with a fight, not with a dramatic moment, just a conversation. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the same table where birthdays had been celebrated, where homework had been done, where I had spent years serving meals without thinking twice about it. He spoke calmly, too calmly, like he had already had this conversation in his head many times before saying it out loud. He wanted a divorce. I remember looking down at my hands while he talked, not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know where else to look. I thought I would feel something immediate, something sharp, but I didn't. It was quiet, like something inside me had already known and had been waiting for the moment it would finally be said. And when it was, there was nothing left to react to. Just silence. The same kind of silence that had been following me for years. Only now, there was nothing left to hide it. After he left, the house didn't feel empty right away. That would have been too obvious, too easy to understand. Instead, it felt unfamiliar. Like I was standing in a place I should recognize, but something about it had shifted just enough to make everything feel slightly off. The furniture was the same. The walls hadn't changed. Even the small things, the marks on the kitchen counter, the chair that creaked if you leaned back too far, were exactly where they had always been. But the space between those things that was different. I remember the first night alone. I didn't turn off the lights, not all of them, just enough to keep the house from feeling completely still. I left the television on too, not to watch it, just for the sound. Voices filling the background, pretending that something was still happening. I sat on the couch longer than I needed to, not thinking, not feeling anything clearly. Just sitting. It's strange how your body can stay in a place long after your mind has already checked out. The next morning came quietly. No footsteps down the hallway, no one asking where something was, no background noise of another person moving through the house. Just silence, pure silence. And for the first time, I noticed how loud that silence could be. I made coffee out of habit. Same cup, same routine. But when I sat down to drink it, it tasted different. Or maybe I just noticed it for the first time. It went cold before I finished it. That became a pattern. There's something about being alone that slows time in a strange way. Moments stretch. Small actions take longer than they should. You start noticing things you never paid attention to before. The sound of the refrigerator humming. The way the light moves across the floor in the afternoon. The slight echo in a room when there's no one else there to absorb it. At first, I tried to stay busy, cleaning things that were already clean, rearranging spaces that didn't need rearranging, opening cabinets just to close them again. It wasn't about the tasks, it was about avoiding the stillness. Because in that stillness, there was a question I wasn't ready to face. Who am I if no one needs me right now? I didn't say it out loud, but it was there, in the background of everything. Days passed like that, then weeks. Time moved forward, but it didn't feel like progress. It felt like repetition. Wake up, move through the day, fill the hours, go to sleep, repeat. Sometimes my children would call. Short conversations, updates about their lives. Work, relationships, plans. I listened more than I spoke. I didn't want to burden them with anything. They had their own lives now, and I had mine, even though I wasn't entirely sure what that meant anymore. One of my sons still lived at home, but even that didn't bring the kind of connection I thought it would. We moved around each other carefully, like there were things we both knew not to say. Old disagreements that had never fully healed. Unspoken tension that settled into the space between us. We weren't fighting, but we weren't close either. Just existing in the same house. Separately, it made the loneliness feel different, not louder, just more complicated, because technically I wasn't alone, and yet I was. I think that's when I started noticing my reflection more, not in a dramatic way, just small moments. Passing by a mirror and catching a glimpse of myself, pausing longer than usual, looking at the lines on my face, the way my posture had changed, the quiet evidence of time moving forward even when everything else felt stuck. I didn't recognize myself entirely, not because I had changed physically, but because I couldn't remember the last time I had looked at myself and seen me. Not a mother, not a wife, just a person. That realization didn't come all at once. It came in pieces, and I didn't know what to do with those pieces yet. It was around that time that I met Arjun. There wasn't anything remarkable about the moment itself. No sudden shift. No feeling that something important was about to happen. It started like most things do. Casually, a conversation that could have easily been forgotten, but it wasn't. He asked simple questions, and then he waited for the answers. That sounds normal, but it wasn't something I was used to. Most people listen to respond. He listened to understand. There's a difference. You feel it in the space between words. We talked about small things at first, everyday things, nothing that seemed important. But somehow, those conversations lasted longer than they should have, and I didn't feel the need to end them. That was new. Usually, I was the one finding a way out of conversations, closing them before they went too deep. But with him, there was no pressure. No expectation, just space. Space to speak, space to pause, space to exist without filling every silence. I didn't realize how much I had been holding back until I started letting small parts of myself surface again. It wasn't dramatic, just subtle shifts, saying something I normally wouldn't say, admitting something I would usually keep to myself, and not feeling judged for it. We started seeing each other more often, not in a way that felt rushed. Just naturally. Coffee sometimes, walks through places that didn't require much conversation. Grocery stores, even standing in aisles talking about nothing important, and somehow those were the moments that stayed with me because they felt easy. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to adjust myself. I didn't feel like I had to become smaller to fit into someone else's space. I could just be there, and that was enough. Our relationship grew quietly. There was no announcement, no clear moment where it shifted from one thing into another. It just deepened. We shared meals, watched television together, sometimes talked for hours, sometimes didn't talk at all, and neither of those things felt uncomfortable. That kind of silence is different. It doesn't feel heavy. It feels shared. When we decided to get married, it didn't feel like a dramatic choice. It felt steady, like something that made sense in a way I hadn't experienced before. But I knew it wouldn't be simple. My children didn't respond the way I had hoped. They didn't say much at first, but I could feel it, in the pauses, in the tone of their voices, in the way conversations became more careful, more distant. It wasn't loud disapproval. It was quieter than that, and somehow that made it harder, because there was nothing to argue against, just a feeling that sat beneath everything. I tried to explain, tried to make them understand, but some things can't be explained in words, especially when emotions are involved. It created a distance between us. Not all at once, but gradually, and that hurt more than I expected, because I had spent so many years building my life around them. And now, the choices I was making for myself were creating space between us. But I still moved forward, because for the first time, I felt like I was choosing something, not adjusting, not reacting, choosing. The years that followed were different, not perfect, but peaceful. We built simple routines: morning tea, evening walks, quiet dinners. There was no urgency in our lives, no constant pressure, just a steady rhythm. And within that rhythm, I found something I hadn't realized I was missing. I felt seen, not for what I did, not for what I provided, but for who I was. That kind of feeling is hard to describe, especially if you've gone a long time without it. It doesn't come with excitement. It comes with calm. And for a while, that calm felt like something I could trust. For a while, I believed that calm meant something had finally settled, like the part of my life that had always felt slightly off had found its place. There was no rush in our days, no pressure to prove anything. We woke up slowly. Mornings didn't feel like something to get through anymore. Sometimes we'd sit with tea longer than necessary, not saying much, just letting the quiet exist between us without needing to fill it. I used to think silence meant something was wrong. Now it felt like something safe. That shift didn't happen overnight. It took time to trust it. Time to believe that I didn't need to be constantly adjusting myself to keep things stable. With Arjun, I wasn't trying to predict moods. I wasn't measuring my words. I wasn't shrinking parts of myself without noticing. I was just there, and he was too. We built something simple, and maybe that's why it felt real. We'd go grocery shopping together, arguing quietly over things that didn't matter, which brand to buy, whether we needed something or not. Small conversations that didn't carry weight, but somehow mattered more than the bigger ones I'd had in my past. Evenings were quiet. Television in the background. Sometimes we'd watch, sometimes we wouldn't. Sometimes we'd talk about our pasts, slowly, like unfolding something fragile. There were things he shared that I hadn't expected, pieces of his life that explained the calm he carried. It wasn't that he had lived an easy life. It was that he had learned how to sit with it. That was something I was still learning. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was performing a role. Not a wife, not a mother, just myself. It took me a while to understand how unfamiliar that felt. And maybe that's why I didn't notice when things started changing. Because nothing changed suddenly. It never does. At first, it was small, so small I could ignore it. He'd come home a little later than usual, not by much. Just enough for me to notice, and then convince myself it didn't matter. Conversations became slightly shorter. Not distant, just less detailed, less curious. There were moments when I'd be speaking and I could feel his attention drifting. Not completely gone, just somewhere else. I didn't say anything, not at first, because everything else still felt normal, and I didn't want to disturb that. I had learned over time how easy it is to question something into breaking, so I stayed quiet. Told myself it was nothing. Told myself I was imagining it. We all do that sometimes. We feel something shifting, and instead of facing it, we soften it in our minds. Make it smaller, more manageable, because the alternative is harder. Admitting that something real is changing. The absences became more noticeable over time. There were nights he didn't come home. At first, there were explanations. Work, delays, things that made sense. And I accepted them, not because I fully believed them, but because I wanted to. There's a difference. Eventually, the explanations became fewer, not replaced by anything. Just gone. And that silence, that's when I started to understand. There's a kind of silence that feels different from all the others. It doesn't ask questions. It answers them, without words, without confirmation. You just know. I remember one evening clearly. I was sitting in the living room. The television was on, but I wasn't watching it. The light outside had already faded, leaving the room in that in-between dimness where everything feels slightly unreal. I realized I hadn't heard from him all day. No message. No call. And instead of feeling worried, I felt something else. Recognition, like a quiet part of me had already accepted something before I allowed myself to think it. I didn't confront him that night, or the next, or the one after that, because what would I say? When the truth isn't spoken, it lives in a different kind of space. One where questions feel unnecessary. One where answers wouldn't change anything. Eventually, I understood. Not through a confession, not through an argument, but through distance. He had found someone else. Younger, different. I didn't ask for details, I didn't need them. Details don't change the reality of something like that, they just make it heavier. He started coming home less, then almost not at all, and just like that, I was alone again. But this time, it felt different. The first time, there had been shock, confusion, a sense of something ending. This time, it felt like something deeper. Not louder, not more painful in the way you'd expect. Just more final. Like I had reached a point in my life where I could no longer pretend not to see what was in front of me. There was no one to blame, not in the way people expect. He had made his choices, and I had made mine. But the outcome, it left me in the same place. A quiet house, a life that had shifted again, and a version of myself I still didn't fully understand. My son was still living with me at the time, but our relationship hadn't changed. If anything, the tension had deepened. We moved around each other carefully. Conversations stayed on the surface. Practical things, daily routines, nothing that touched what was really there. It created a strange kind of environment, one where the house wasn't empty but still felt divided, like two separate lives existing under the same roof. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't know how, and maybe part of me didn't have the energy anymore, so I did what I had always done. I created routines, morning coffee, even if I didn't feel like drinking it. Television in the background, even if I wasn't watching. Small tasks to fill the hours, even when they didn't need to be filled. But something was different now. I started noticing things I hadn't before, not just around me, but within me. I'd catch my reflection in the mirror, and instead of looking away quickly like I used to, I'd pause, really look, not at the surface, but at the person standing there, trying to recognize her, trying to understand how she had become someone who had spent so many years adjusting to everything except herself. That thought stayed with me, not as something loud, not as something overwhelming, just present, like a quiet truth that had finally surfaced. And one night, sitting alone in the living room, that thought became clearer. I had spent most of my life living for other people. My parents, my first husband, my children, even Arjun in a way, every decision, every adjustment, every version of myself. It had all been shaped by someone else's needs, and somewhere in all of that, I had disappeared. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually. And the strangest part was realizing it didn't hurt the way I thought it would. It didn't break me. It didn't overwhelm me. It just settled, like a truth that had been waiting for me to stop long enough to see it. And for the first time in my life, I didn't look away from it. That night didn't change everything. There was no sudden clarity, no moment where I woke up the next morning and felt like a different person. It doesn't work like that. What changed was quieter, more internal. I stopped avoiding myself. That was the first shift, not dramatic, not visible to anyone else. Just a decision to stay present with my own thoughts instead of moving past them. Before that, I had always found ways to fill the space. Noise, tasks, other people, anything that kept me from sitting too long with what I was feeling. But now, I let it stay, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it didn't make sense. I started noticing how often I had ignored myself. Small things at first, what I liked, what I didn't, what I felt like doing versus what I thought I should be doing. It sounds simple, but when you've spent years responding to everyone else, you don't always know how to respond to yourself. So I started slowly. Mornings became different, not busy, just intentional. I'd still make coffee, still use the same cup. But instead of moving on immediately to the next thing, I'd sit at the table, by the window, sometimes in silence. And I'd stay there longer than I used to, long enough to actually feel the moment. Sometimes the coffee would still go cold, but now I noticed it. I didn't rush past it. That might not sound important, but it was, because for the first time, I wasn't trying to escape my own life. I started going to church more regularly, not because I felt obligated, not because I was searching for answers, but because it gave me something I hadn't found anywhere else. Stillness, that didn't feel heavy. A kind of quiet that didn't press against me, just space. I didn't always listen closely to what was being said. Sometimes I just sat there, letting the time pass without needing to fill it, and somehow that helped. I began volunteering too, nothing big, small things, helping where I could. It wasn't about being needed again. At least, not in the way it used to be. It was different, lighter. I showed up, I did what I could, and then I left. No expectation. No pressure to be anything more than what I was in that moment. That was new for me. For so long, everything I did had felt tied to responsibility, to identity, to being seen a certain way. This didn't. It just existed, and that made it easier to breathe. The garden became part of my routine without me planning it. At first, it was just something to do, a way to spend time without thinking too much, pulling weeds, watering plants, adjusting small things, but over time, it became something else. There's a certain kind of quiet in tending to living things, not silence, but presence. You don't have to rush, you don't have to prove anything. You just show up, and things grow in their own time. I found comfort in that, more than I expected. Days started to feel less like something I had to get through, and more like something I could move within. Not every day. Some were still heavy. Some still stretched longer than I wanted them to. But they weren't all the same anymore. And that mattered. I reconnected with my daughters slowly. Carefully. There was distance there, not just from time, but from choices, from things we had never fully said to each other. At first, our conversations were simple, surface level, safe, but even that was something, because for a while there had been nothing. We didn't try to fix everything at once. We didn't go back and unpack every moment that had created distance between us. We just started where we were, and that was enough. There were pauses, awkward ones, moments where neither of us knew what to say next, but we stayed. That was the difference. We didn't leave the conversation unfinished the way we used to. We stayed in it even when it wasn't easy. And slowly, that space between us began to soften, not disappear, but soften. Time didn't fix everything. It doesn't do that. But it changed the way things felt. Edges that used to be sharp became less so, not because they weren't there anymore, but because I wasn't holding onto them as tightly. I didn't feel the need to explain every decision I had made, or defend it, or justify it. That part of me had quieted down. I understood something now that I hadn't before. Not everyone will understand your life the way you do, and that's okay. It doesn't make your choices wrong. It just makes them yours. That realization didn't come with confidence. It came with calm, and that calm stayed, even when things around me didn't. Years passed, not dramatically, not in big, memorable events, just steadily. And then one day, Arjun came back, not in the way people imagine. There was no sudden appearance, no unexpected moment at the door. He reached out, a message, simple, careful, as if he wasn't sure how it would be received. I saw his name on my phone and felt something shift. Not strongly, not in a way that pulled me back, just recognition, like seeing a part of my past that still existed somewhere outside of me. I didn't respond right away. I let it sit, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to understand what I felt first. And what I felt wasn't what I expected. There was no anger, no urgency, no longing, just curiosity. We eventually met in a quiet place. Nothing significant about it, just somewhere neutral. When I saw him, I noticed the changes immediately, not just physically, something in the way he carried himself. He looked tired, in a way that felt familiar, like he had been through something that had reshaped him. We sat down, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Not out of discomfort, just taking in the reality of being in the same space again. He apologized, not with dramatic words, not trying to explain everything at once. Just honestly. He said he had made mistakes, that he had hurt me, that he understood that now. I listened. That's all I did. I didn't interrupt. I didn't question. I didn't ask for details because I didn't need them. There was a time when I would have. A time when I would have needed every answer. But that time had passed. He looked at me differently, like he was trying to understand something he hadn't seen before, and maybe he was, because I wasn't the same person he had left, not in the ways that mattered. When he finished speaking, there was a pause, and in that pause, I realized something clearly. I had already let go, not in a dramatic way, not through a conscious decision, but slowly, over time, piece by piece, until there was nothing left to hold on to. I forgave him, quietly, not as something I announced, not as something I needed him to acknowledge, just internally, because the weight of holding onto it didn't belong to me anymore. But forgiveness isn't the same as returning, and that's what I understood in that moment. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel incomplete on my own. There was no space inside me that needed to be filled by someone else. No part of me waiting to be chosen, or fixed, or completed. I was already whole, in a quiet way, in a way that didn't need to be proven. And because of that, I didn't go back. There wasn't a moment where everything suddenly made sense. No clean ending, no feeling of everything falling into place. That's not how my life ever worked. What I had instead was something quieter, something steadier. After I saw Arjun that day, I didn't feel shaken. That surprised me. There was a time when even the thought of seeing him again would have pulled something loose inside me. Questions, memories, old emotions rising to the surface all at once. But none of that happened. I went home the same way I had left, unlocked the door, stepped inside, set my bag down in the same place I always did, and the house felt the same. Not empty, not heavy, just mine. That was new. For most of my life, every space I lived in had been shared, defined by other people's presence, their routines, their needs. Even when I was alone, the space didn't feel like it belonged entirely to me. Now it did. And I didn't need to adjust myself inside it anymore. That evening, I made tea instead of coffee. I don't know why. Maybe I just wanted something different, something small that didn't follow the same pattern. I sat by the window like I usually did. The light was softer that day, or maybe I was just noticing it more. I've realized something about light over the years. It doesn't really change that much. What changes is how you see it. There was a time when evenings felt long, heavy, like something I had to get through. Now they felt slower, not empty, just open. I didn't feel the need to fill every moment anymore. I could sit there doing nothing, and it didn't feel like something was missing. That took me a long time to understand. The difference between empty and quiet. They look the same from the outside, but they feel completely different when you're inside them. My days are still simple. That hasn't changed. I wake up early most mornings, not because I have to, but because I like the stillness before everything else begins. There's a moment, just before the world fully wakes up, where everything feels softer. Less demanding. I make my coffee. Sometimes I drink it while it's still hot. Sometimes I don't, and that's okay. I don't rush through it anymore. I don't rush through anything the way I used to. That constant urgency I carried for years is gone. I spend time in the garden more now, not as something to pass the time, but because I want to be there. I've learned the names of some of the plants, not all of them. I don't feel the need to know everything. I just take care of what's in front of me, watering them, watching them change. Some days they grow, some days they don't, and I've stopped expecting immediate results. There's something comforting about that. Life doesn't move all at once. It moves quietly, in ways you don't always see right away. I think I'm learning to move like that too. My relationship with my children is different now, not the same as it was before, but not distant in the way it used to be either. We talk. Not every day, not always about important things, but the conversations feel easier. There's less tension in them, less expectation. I don't try to explain my life to them anymore, not in the way I once did. I share what feels natural, and I let the rest exist without needing to be understood. That space between us, it's still there, but it's not as heavy. It doesn't carry the same weight it once did, and that's enough. I've stopped measuring my life by what it's supposed to look like. That idea, it used to guide everything. What a good marriage should be. What a complete family should feel like. What happiness is supposed to look like from the outside. I believed in all of it for a long time, and maybe those things exist for some people. But for me, life didn't follow that pattern. It moved differently, slower in some ways, more complicated in others. And for a while, I thought that meant something was wrong, that I had missed something, that I hadn't done something the right way. I don't think that anymore. I think I was just living. In the only way I knew how at the time. And now I'm living differently. Not better, not worse, just more honestly. There are still moments when the past comes back, not in a painful way, just present, a memory, a feeling, something small that reminds me of who I used to be, and when that happens, I don't push it away. I don't hold on to it either, I just let it pass, like everything else. That's something I've learned too, not everything needs to be held onto. Some things are meant to move through you, and then go. Even now, there are days when the house is completely silent. No phone calls, no background noise, just me moving through the space. And sometimes I stop. In the middle of a room, for no reason, just to notice where I am. There was a time when that kind of stillness would have made me uncomfortable. I would have reached for something. The television, the phone, anything to break it. Now I stay there for a few seconds, sometimes longer, and I let that quiet exist because it doesn't feel like loneliness anymore. It feels like presence, in my own life. And that's something I didn't have for a long time. I still sit by the window in the evenings. That hasn't changed. It's become part of my routine, watching the light fade. The way the sky shifts without asking for attention. It reminds me of something I didn't understand before, that not everything needs to be intense to be meaningful. Some things are quiet, subtle, easy to miss if you're not paying attention, but they matter just as much. Maybe more. I don't think about the future the way I used to. I don't try to plan everything or shape it into something specific. I let it stay open. That used to scare me. Now it doesn't, because I've already lived through uncertainty, through change, through losing things I thought I needed, and I'm still here, still moving, still okay, not perfect, not complete in the way I once believed life had to be, but steady, grounded, enough. That word used to feel like settling, like accepting less than what life should be. Now it feels different. It feels honest. There's a kind of peace in realizing you don't need everything to be perfect for it to be meaningful, that you don't need constant noise for your life to feel full. That being alone doesn't always mean being lonely. I didn't understand that for most of my life. I thought loneliness came from people leaving, from empty rooms, from silence. But now I know sometimes it starts much earlier than that. And sometimes it ends quietly too, not with something new entering your life, but with you finally returning to it. These days, when I sit by the window and watch the light fade, I don't feel like I'm waiting for something anymore. I'm not trying to fill a space or reach a place. I'm just here, and for the first time, that feels like enough.